Welcome back, everyone. Spring and summer is a time for new growth and taking bold action together. So we hope these stories can inspire you to live boldly, take wise chances, and with our friends and family, make a difference together. Today we will be reading The Adventures of Wishbone, Digging to the Center of the Earth by Michael Anthony Steele, inspired by A Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. So lean in with a spirit of adventure, grab a friend, and let's enjoy the story together. Soon after the discovery of Hans River, the three travelers began to emerge from the surrounding lava. Layers of very old soil began to appear, mixed in among the hardened lava. And as they descended, the hardened lava all but disappeared. Oh, I said lava like so many times just then. No explorers had ever found themselves placed in such a position to study nature in all her true beauty. Throughout the tunnel walls, there were streaks of copper, manganese, platinum, and gold. The light from the Ruhmkorff coils seemed to brighten beyond belief as it bounced off all the brilliantly colored rocks and appeared to send jets of fire in every direction. This time Axel was in the lead. It seemed his fear had left him as he led the group farther into the depths of the earth. His fear left him as he went further into the depths. Okay, interesting. For 11 more days, they traveled in a leisurely manner. The runoff from Hans River was at their feet, guiding and refreshing them. Professor Lindenbrock hardly touched his canteen anymore. Whenever he would become thirsty, he would simply lower his head and lap up the refreshing water Hans River offered. Sometimes, on the very steep descents, the river's waters would turn into a raging waterfall. Its mighty roar equaled the professor's own obsession to reach the Earth's core. I don't know if any waterfall could equal that, but all right. But most of the time, the cavern's downward direction was gradual enough that the Hans River ran along as quietly and calmly as the man for whom it was named. On the 20th day after they entered the shaft, Professor Lindenbrock stopped to check his notes and calculations. Hans stopped as well. Once again, he found a large rock to sit upon. Axel was in the lead and still moving on. The professor peered ahead through the tunnel, but he saw only darkness. He wasn't worried, however. No doubt Axel's lamplight was hidden around a corner, and the beam was swallowed up by the tunnel's darkness. No matter. The professor would not take long to finish his notes and calculations. He and Hans would catch up to Axel soon enough. Professor Lindenbrock slipped his pack off and nudged open the top flap. He reached into it and with his teeth gently pulled out a small leather-bound book. He had been entering into the book every angle of descent and every compass and manometer reading. He laid the book on the hard ground, being careful not to place it too close to where the waters of Hans River flowed. He opened the volume and flipped through the pages with his nose. As he went over all the notes and measurements listed, he couldn't believe what he suddenly realized. According to his calculations, they had already traveled 90 miles below the Earth's surface. There were also no longer any under Sneffels or even Iceland. They had been traveling directly under the Atlantic Ocean for some time. At that very moment, there could be fierce storms raging miles above them on the ocean's surface, or there could be giant whales cruising near the bottom of the sea, a bottom that was now the roof over their heads. This is exciting. Professor Lindenbrock closed the book and placed it into his pack. We must find Axel, he told Hans. He will be very surprised to learn that 3 of us are walking under the Atlantic Ocean. Professor and Hans went further down the passage in search of Axel. The last time they had seen him, he was examining and collecting samples of different layers of ancient granite. Professor Lindenbrock trotted along, eager to tell Axel the good news. The 2 companions continued down the ancient tunnel for almost an hour. Still, there was no sign of Axel. The professor was sure they would have caught up to him by now. Axel, Professor loudly called. Axel, where are you, my dear boy? Only the quiet babbling of the stream from Hans River answered. For another half hour they searched. Professor Lindenbrock became more concerned. Hans, he said urgently, try firing a shot with your rifle. Perhaps that sound will carry farther than our voices. The professor sat down and watched as Hans went into action. Hans removed the rifle and powder horn that were slung over his shoulder. He carefully poured a sufficient amount of powder down the barrel. With a rod, he plunged a wad of cloth into the barrel. The professor noticed that Hans didn't add a lead ball. He thought that was a wise idea. After all, it was possible that the bullet would ricochet around the tiny cavern and make its way to Axel or even back to them. So without the lead ball, without the bullet, essentially, it would make the loud noise without actually shooting anything. So it's going to combust, it's going to light and make the loud noise, but they're not actually shooting anything, which is good. Hans aimed the rifle towards the top of the tunnel and fired. The roar was deafening as the sound vibrated and echoed off the walkway. Oh, that really is so loud. Sound was especially loud to the professor with his keen hearing. Oh, like me. When Hans prepared to fire another shot, Professor Lindenbrock quickly placed his paws over his ears. After Hans had fired the rifle once more, they both listened carefully for a response. Okay, I'm reading right now the real story, and so for a second I was like, why is he using his mouth? But that's because he's a dog. I'm fine. Everything's fine. Okay. It's like I'm really missing something. Okay. Pause. Got it. Okay. Um, let's see. So, okay. After Hans had fired the rifle once more, they both listened carefully for a response. The echoing sound of the rifle was getting dimmer as it bounced around the corridor. When the noise had finally stopped, all the professor could hear was the soft sound of Hans River running beside their feet, that and the slightest ringing in his ears from Hans's first shot. He wished he had covered his ears for the first of Hans's shot. The professor promised not to let himself again be so wrapped up in his work that he would forget to pay attention to common sense. Oh, I don't see that happening. Professor Lindenbrock hoped Axel was all right. There was no doubt many dangers he could have run into. Professor had confidence in his nephew's abilities. However, any one of the travelers would be in more danger by himself than with the other two. Professor was very concerned for Axel's safety. No journey, no matter how incredible, would be worth the loss of his nephew's life. Professor knew he couldn't live with himself if his quest for discovery brought harm to his dear nephew Axel. Professor Lindenbrock sat listening for some response from Axel. He then realized that he had ignored another matter of common sense, and it was not just a question of common sense, but his sense of smell. That was it. The professor had an unusually strong sense of smell. As he placed his nose to the ground, he realized that he should have thought of this before. He took in a deep breath of the dusty ground through his sensitive nostrils. He smelled scents from himself and from Hans, but not from Axel. He sniffed around some more and then realized the awful truth. Axel had not traveled down this passageway. There wasn't a trace of his nephew's scent anywhere. Could it be true? The professor knew that Axel had been in front of them. Could he and Hans, during their search, have passed a tunnel leading off the main passageway? Could they have mistaken this passageway for one of the many shadows that they passed? That had to be the answer. Axel did not travel this far, Hans, the professor said confidently. We must retrace our steps. With his nose to the ground, Professor Lindenbrock trotted back up the gentle slope of the passageway. Keep firing your rifle, Hans. I want Axel to know that help is on the way. Together, the pair continued their backward journey in the sloping tunnel for almost an hour. Professor Lindenbrock ran faster and faster, putting more distance between himself and Hans. Oh, that's a good idea. Once again, he let his emotions get the best of him. When he realized this, he stopped and quickly pointed his nose to the ground. He smelled traces of himself, Hans, and Axel. He took a few more sniffs to be sure. It was Axel, all right. The professor had found his nephew's trail. Behind him, he heard Hans's rifle fire again. He didn't have to place his paws over his ears this time. His running had put some distance between him and the eider feather hunter. Professor Lindenbrock began to make his way back down the tunnel towards Hans. His nose to the ground, he was trying to find the spot where Axel had become separated from him and their guide. As he went, his eyes looked ahead of him to see the glow of Hans's lamp rounding a corner. Soon after, the professor could make out the figure of the trusty guide as he approached. He was pouring powder down the barrel of his rifle for another shot. Hold your fire, Hans, Professor Lindenbrock said, trotting over to him quickly. I feel we are close to where Axel lost his way. Once the professor had reached Hans, he placed his nose to the ground. Once again, however, he smelled only his and Hans's trail. He turned and looked back down the tunnel. All he saw beside him was a single narrow passageway. Hans, the professor said as he slowly stepped through the empty passageway, hold your lamp out high and move it around slowly. Hans did as he was told, and he cautiously followed the professor. Professor Lindenbrock watched the shadows move and sway with the movement of the light. The tunnel had many rock outcroppings that cast deep shadows from both their lamps. However, as they approached, most of the swaying shadows disappeared. The professor was looking for one particular shadow that would not disappear when they approached. And he found it! It was ahead of them, on the right, just behind a large outgrowth of rock that went from top to bottom. A tall shadow didn't sway in the moving lamplight and remained dark when they approached. Professor Lindenbrock turned to face the shadow. His lamplight opened up the darkness. It was another passageway. There was one thing that puzzled the professor. He walked past the new tunnel's entrance. Then he turned to look at it from another direction. Fascinating, the professor said to himself when he looked back down the tunnel. All he saw was his guide, Hans. He stood in the middle of what looked like a wall. There was an outcropping of rock on both sides of the tunnel entrance. It made the new cavern almost invisible unless someone was standing right beside it. And Axel had the light. Quite an optical illusion. Here's another picture. Professor Lindenbrock said, shaking his head. Let me see it. Hans walked over to where the professor was standing. The guide shook his head in agreement. The professor continued, "We were in such a hurry we did not even see this passageway." Took a couple of steps in the newly discovered tunnel. The new passageway ran in an upward direction, so no water from Hans River flowed into it. Professor looked around, then he placed his nose to the ground again. He'd been right. In the dry dirt and rock of this passageway, he smelled only Axel's trail. Then he turned his attention from the ground to the wall of the entrance. He leapt up and placed his front paws onto the right side of the entrance. His lamp shone on granite formations just like the kind his nephew had been closely studying the last time they had seen him. Professor Lindenbrock poked his head farther into the tunnel's entrance. "Axel," he yelled. "Axel, can you hear me?" He waited for a reply, but there was only silence. Professor turned to Hans. "Prepare to fire another shot." Professor turned back to look at the cavern. Then, with all his might, he listened very carefully. An idea struck him. "Axel!" Professor Lindenbrock called for his nephew once more. Then he pressed his right ear against the cool granite wall and listened. Very faintly, he heard a reply. "Uncle Lindenbrock!" Axel replied. "Axel, my dear boy, is that you?" Professor replied, his ear still pressed against the wall. There was a short delay between his question and Axel's answer. "Yes, yes," replied Axel. "Where are you?" Professor asked. There was a pause, and Axel replied, "I'm lost in total darkness. I fell and broke my lamp." Another pause. "But where are you, Uncle? I can barely hear you." "Speak into the wall," replied the professor. "The granite carries the sound of your voice like wire conduits, conducts electricity. Keep talking and we'll find you." Professor Lindenbrock turned to Hans, who was slinging his rifle over his shoulder. "Let us hurry, Hans." Slowly, Professor and Hans made their way through the newly discovered tunnel. The sound of Hans River faded away behind them. Axel continued to speak. "When I first heard your voice, Uncle, I thought I was losing my mind and just kept imagining I heard you." "Keep your courage, dear Axel," Professor answered, speaking directly into the solid rock wall. "We shall soon be together again." But while Axel was making his last remark, the professor thought he heard footsteps. It seemed as if Axel had been walking. "Axel!" the professor called out. "Stay right where you are. It's too dangerous for you to be moving around without the aid of light. Don't worry, we will find you." A pause. Then, "It's all right, Uncle. I can feel my way along the wall with both of us moving steadily toward each other. We'll be together in half the time." The professor was quite worried. Making up time is not worth any injuries you should suffer by groping around in total darkness. He put his mouth even closer to the granite wall. "So please, Axel, stay where you—" Suddenly, Professor Lindenbrock heard a terrible noise, the sound of falling rock. "Uncle!" Axel's voice came through the tunnel. There were some more crumbling noises and only silence. "Axel!" the professor cried, put his ear to the wall, and waited for an answer. When none came, he repeated his cry, "Axel! Axel!" He waited, his ear pressed hard to the granite wall. Axel did not answer. Professor Lindenbrock turned to Hans. "Hans, I fear that Axel has met with a horrible accident. We must now double our efforts to find him." Once again, the professor placed his nose to the ground. He picked up Axel's trail. He and Hans would have to rely on only one of his senses to find Axel. The professor hoped it wouldn't be too late. "Oh, I hate to leave a good story during such a tense moment, but my stomach is calling me and something else is late. My dinner time." That does it for chapter 6. We'll see you next time for chapter 7.